I am Giuseppe Strappa. I'm teaching urban morphology in the Faculty of Architecture of Sapienza in Rome and in Laval University, Quebec City. In two Faculty of Architecture which has got a solid tradition in the field of urban morphology, the first with the teaching of Gianfranco Caniggia, and the second with Pierre La Rochelle. I'm trying to give you some idea about our way of teaching, mostly trying to demonstrate as our way of reading the urban morphology as form in transformation is more than a typological tool, a creative, a generative tool for architectural design. First of all, I'll try to give you an idea of the history of our method. Its early roots go back to the Roman school of didactic system based on the study of operating history and ancient monuments. It was developed by innovative teachers as Gustavo Giovannoni and Giovanni Battista Milani in the 30s mostly. They proposed an history new centrality in built environment interpretation, and the teaching was based on rules analogically derived from the comparison between synchronic architectural works, demonstrating their constructive and historical necessity. The study of ancient heritage was considered as a kind of synthesis of all architectural disciplines. It was not just intended for preservation of the historical document, but also, like any design, for a critical modification of the built environment. In some way, they anticipated the method of redesign proposed by Saverio Muratori in the 60s and in the 70s by Gianfranco Caniggia, whose teaching we tried to develop in an original way. As for our method, we intend the term urban morphology as the study of the form considered as the visible aspect of a structure in transformation. The meaning of the term form is referred to a development through a formative process able to be rationally studied as a design tool. According to this point of view, urban form could be considered as the visible aspect of an organism able to produce transformation through its own internal rules which link the different parts in a unity. This explains why our method is based mostly on two central notions. The first one is the notion of organism as integrated, self-sufficient correlation of complementary elements expressing a unitary aim. And the second, the one of process, which is considered as a series of actions that produce transformation in built landscape. Both express an interpretation of built landscape as matter in becoming, introducing the notion of time into that of space. Cities are conceived so as the result of a never-ending transformation process, and buildings are considered as organisms in which the actual shape derives from a process starting from the matter, which becomes material, elements, structure, and at the end, built organism. And as any organism, their stories could be subdivided in phases: the forming phases, the transforming one, the updating, and also the ruin, as last phase, rarely studied, but very significant, in my opinion, for architects. In conceiving the built environment as an organic process, the first step is the individuation of the main development phases. In these roots play a fundamental role. Cities are not a set of isolated objects, but a society of objects, whose rules are explained by routes and courses. From the interpretation of the connecting system, we can identify the phases of formation and transformation of built environment. The form of built landscape is unitary and indivisible, yet we need to separate its complexity into simpler notions to be able to study it. Among the many possibilities which we can have, I believe that the simplification hypothesis that comes closest to reality can be made dividing the built reality in four main components: the roads, poles, base building, and spatial building. Following this approach, the most important road can be interpreted as matrix, the original road that exists before the construction takes place. The notion of matrix road derives from the obvious consideration that the first phase of structuring the territory is its crossing. The form of the resulting roads are conditioned by the solidarity with the shape of the soil, but also by planning will or by historical and anthropic pre-existence. Via del Corso, for example, represented here in the slide, is a territorial road inside the tissue that became the ancient Via Lata. In 1467, the Pope Pius II rebuilt entirely the road and then became a metric road starting from Porta del Popolo along with the two other metric roads of Via Ripetta and Via del Babuino. We intend as node the singular point of a continuum determined by the intersection of two continuums or by the gemmation of one continuum with another. Each component of a structure connecting with each other determines a nodality of different grades, and the notion of continuum can be applied to different scales, from built-in to territorial ones. In particular, an urban node can be formed from the intersection between two roads. Pole is the sublimation of the term node, in general determined by the presence of more continuums, not so intersecting as ending or starting from a point. Following Caniggia, the distinction between node and pole depends, it should be noted, on the reading scale. The pole, from the Latin polus, thus indicates the place of convergence or origin of the roads, resulting in a progressive specialization of the fabric, as in the example shown in the slides of Piazza del Popolo and Piazza Venezia, which form the poles of the Via del Corso. Building roads are chronologically successive and subordinate to the matrix road. They are traced in the function of the construction in depth. For economical and functional reason, the aggregate tends to use the rear areas instead of continuing a linear expansion, as in the slide example of Via Laurina, orthogonal to Via del Corso, which is shown in the slide. The second phase of construction generally takes place by orientating the new roads orthogonally to the matrix ones, distancing each other from the depth of two of the new plots. Finally, connecting roads join together different building roads. They can be formed mainly in two ways: for suppression of building insistent on two continuous plots, or for planned construction of a new road. In the tissue, we can also find a fourth type of road, reconstruction road at the end of forming process in mature aggregates where new relevant poles are formed, creating new connection requirements. These are therefore traumatic roads that characterize the transformation of modern cities, overlapping with the existing organism, considered obsolete, on the basis of a new notion of fabric. We see here the example of Viale Trastevere, which had been cut in the old tissue, and the innovative building types which are generated from the forming of new triangular plots, or anyway irregular plots. Base buildings are considered all the buildings in which the function is related to dwelling. The term base derives from its main character. Following the building process, each form of architecture and building derives from the house. A clear example derives from European cities in which the great majority of the construction is made by housing, and from these structures were developed more complex building and architecture, and in general the cities. The most common base building type in Rome is the row house and its multifamily development, the so-called in linea house. The special building term so means all the non-residential part of the built environment, also including those building types, where the housing function is secondary to that which gives rise to the specialization of the type. In a schematic way, we can divide special building in spatial serial building, which is the part of the built environment made up of special buildings which do not have a dominant space, but are structured through repetition in a series of equal spaces. The spatial serial building spaces are aggregated with laws similar to those of urban fabric. We can see here the example of the forming process of the palaces in the area of Insula Mattei in Rome. The special nodal building is that part of the building environment made up of buildings that have a predominant space with respect to the other associated ones. That is a special, constructive, functional nodality that unify the whole organism, as in the example shown in the slide here, which show the Massenzio Basilica. We can extend the notion of type to urban fabric. In this sense, the fabric could be defined as the sum of processually determined characters that distinguish the formation of a building aggregate. In other words, the notion of fabric is to the aggregate as the notion of type is to the building. A fabric is thus characterized by an iterative law recognizable synchronously in a set of aggregates depending on the various cultural areas, and diachronically in successive phases of the transformation. The formation of fabric is obviously determined by the forms of the soil properties and the fractioning in plots. Our reading method is taught initially by reading the ancient city as a text. But even in the modern city, the same anthropic principle can be read updated. The reading of eastern suburb of Rome, illustrated by the slides, based on courses that are formed on the ridges, show how even the areas transformed by building speculation can be interpreted as an historical territory, where processes of formation and transformation of fabric are recognized. It is therefore necessary, in conclusion, to try to understand what is the general structure of fabrics in their repeatable character, which is also a way of establishing hierarchies and scales, recognize the typical and the exception, that is design. The general principle of any hypothesis that wants to contribute to solving the problem of fabric transformation is related to the passing of time, to process. It determines the order of things, a succession of ways of living the space, the base construction and specialization resulting from it. The link between reality to transform, experience, and critical knowledge is a circular relationship where the design is also a form of active knowledge aiming at operating.